The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac of London Heathrow Airport as Captain Marcus Williams adjusted his formal military uniform one last time. He was a Royal Guard with 15 years of impeccable service, and today's mission was unlike any other he had undertaken. His task was to escort a collection of priceless royal artifacts to a diplomatic exhibition in Washington, D.C. The items included historical documents signed by Queen Victoria, ceremonial swords dating back 3 centuries, and jeweled crowns that had adorned the heads of British monarchs for generations. Marcus carried himself with the disciplined posture that had become second nature during his years serving at Buckingham Palace. His colleagues often said he could stand perfectly still for hours, a human statue dedicated to duty and honor. Today, however, his mind raced with the weight of responsibility. The artifacts were valued at over £50 million, but their historical significance was truly immeasurable. Beside him stood Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a sharp-minded officer who had been specially selected for this assignment. Sarah had joined the Royal Guard only 5 years ago, but her attention to detail and quick thinking had earned her rapid promotions. She carried a leather briefcase containing all the necessary documentation, permits, and certificates that would allow them to transport these treasures across international borders. The security team had spent weeks planning every detail of this journey. They had coordinated with airport authorities, customs officials, and diplomatic services on both sides of the Atlantic. Everything had been arranged with military precision. The artifacts were secured in specially designed cases, each one fitted with sensors and GPS tracking devices. These cases were built to withstand extreme conditions and were virtually impenetrable. As they approached the airport's VIP entrance, Marcus noticed the unusual number of police vehicles parked near the building. Sarah caught his glance and frowned slightly. This wasn't part of the plan. They had been assured that their arrival would be discreet, with minimal attention drawn to their mission. The presence of so many security personnel suggested something had changed. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere felt tense. Airport staff moved with hurried steps, speaking in hushed tones. Marcus and Sarah exchanged concerned looks, but proceeded toward the special security checkpoint that had been arranged for their cargo. They were met by Airport Security Chief Thomas Blake, a stout man with graying hair and a permanent frown etched across his weathered face. Thomas barely acknowledged their arrival with a curt nod. He seemed distracted, constantly checking his radio and glancing toward the main terminal. Marcus introduced himself and Sarah, presenting their credentials and the diplomatic papers that granted them special clearance. Thomas took the documents without really looking at them, his attention divided between the papers and whatever situation was unfolding elsewhere in the airport. The chief called over 2 of his officers, instructing them to begin the inspection process. This was expected. Despite their diplomatic status and royal authorization, security protocols required that the cargo be examined. Marcus had anticipated this and was prepared to cooperate fully, though he would not allow the artifact cases to be opened without proper supervision and the presence of the museum curator who was scheduled to meet them. Officer David Morrison approached first, a young man who appeared to be in his late 20s with an overly confident swagger. He circled around the secured trolley carrying the artifact cases, tapping his fingers on the metallic containers. His partner, Officer Rachel Stevens, seemed more professional, carefully reviewing the manifest that listed each item being transported. David picked up his radio and spoke into it, but the words were too quiet for Marcus to hear clearly. Something in the officer's tone made Marcus uneasy. There was an edge to it, almost confrontational. Sarah noticed it too and moved slightly closer to the cargo, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her military identification badge. Within minutes, additional officers began arriving at the checkpoint. First 2, then 4. Then nearly a dozen security personnel surrounded the area where Marcus and Sarah stood with their precious cargo. The atmosphere shifted dramatically from routine inspection to something that felt almost like a confrontation. Travelers passing through nearby sections of the terminal began to slow down and stare, wondering what situation was unfolding. Chief Blake returned, this time accompanied by a woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as Airport Security Supervisor Jennifer Walsh. Her expression was stern, and she carried a tablet computer which she tapped aggressively as she approached. Jennifer barely made eye contact with Marcus as she spoke, her words clipped and formal. She informed them that there had been reports of suspicious cargo being transported through the airport that morning. Intelligence services had received anonymous tips about potential smuggling operations involving high-value items disguised as diplomatic shipments. Therefore, she explained, all special cargo would be subject to enhanced screening procedures, regardless of diplomatic status or prior clearances. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had dealt with bureaucratic complications before, but this felt different. The timing was too convenient, and the sudden change in protocol too dramatic. He calmly explained the nature of their mission, the months of planning that had gone into this transport, and the approvals they had received from the highest levels of both British and American governments. Jennifer remained unmoved. She stated that airport security operated under its own authority, and that recent terror threats had given them expanded powers to inspect any cargo they deemed necessary. The royal artifacts, she insisted, would need to be fully examined, and the cases would need to be opened for complete inspection. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. She explained that the artifact cases were sealed with tamper-evident locks that could only be opened in the presence of authorized museum personnel. Breaking these seals without proper authority could damage priceless historical items and would violate international agreements. Regarding the transport of cultural treasures, the supervisor's face hardened. She suggested that if Marcus and Sarah were unwilling to cooperate with security protocols, they could be detained for obstructing airport security operations. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Marcus realized with growing concern that this situation was escalating far beyond a simple security check. Something else was happening here, something that didn't add up, and he needed to figure out what it was before this mission was completely derailed. Marcus took a deep breath and reached for his secure phone, intending to contact his commanding officer at the Ministry of Defense. Before he could dial, Officer Morrison stepped forward and firmly told him that no communications would be permitted until the security inspection was complete. The young officer's hand rested on his belt, near where security personnel typically carried restraints, making the implicit threat clear. Sarah's eyes widened at this development. They were being treated not as diplomatic couriers on an official mission, but as suspects in some kind of investigation. She noticed other officers positioning themselves strategically around their location, blocking potential exit routes. The situation had transformed from uncomfortable to genuinely alarming. Marcus decided to try a different approach. He asked to speak with someone from the British consulate or the airport's diplomatic liaison office. Surely there had been some misunderstanding that could be quickly resolved through proper channels. Jennifer Walsh shook her head dismissively, stating that consular services had been notified and were reviewing the situation. But until then, airport security would proceed with their examination. A specialized scanning machine was wheeled over to their location, a large device that Marcus didn't recognize from previous diplomatic transports. The technician operating it explained that it was new equipment capable of penetrating even hardened containers to create detailed images of their contents. Marcus explained again that the artifacts were fragile and extremely valuable, some dating back over 300 years. Exposing them to unknown scanning technology without proper assessment could potentially cause irreparable damage. The technician seemed genuinely concerned by this information and looked toward Supervisor Walsh for guidance. She waved away the concern, insisting that the equipment was perfectly safe and had been approved for all cargo inspections. Marcus noticed a brief exchange of glances between some of the officers, suggesting that not everyone present was comfortable with how this situation was being handled. As the technician prepared the scanning equipment, a commotion erupted near the main security checkpoint. Raised voices echoed through the terminal, and several officers rushed away from Marcus and Sarah's location to address whatever new situation had developed. This momentary distraction gave Marcus a precious few seconds to quietly activate a discreet tracking alert on his secure device, a signal that would notify his superiors that the mission had encountered serious complications. Sarah used the moment to photograph the identification badges of the officers surrounding them, pretending to adjust her uniform while discreetly using her phone's camera. If this situation continued to deteriorate, they would need evidence of exactly who had been involved in disrupting their authorized diplomatic mission. Officer Morrison returned his attention to them, demanding to know what they were doing. Marcus responded calmly that they were simply waiting for the inspection to proceed, maintaining his composure despite the growing tension. He had been trained to remain calm under pressure, and that training was being thoroughly tested now. The scanning process began, with the machine's sensors moving slowly over the sealed cases containing the royal artifacts. Images appeared on a connected monitor, showing the outlines of the objects inside. Marcus watched carefully, worried about what this powerful scanning technology might be doing to items that had survived centuries only to potentially be damaged by overzealous security theater. Suddenly, one of the officers examining the scans called out that they had detected anomalies in the readings. Supervisor Walsh moved closer to examine the monitor, her expression growing more suspicious. She pointed to certain areas of the scan that showed dense, irregular shapes. Marcus tried to explain that these were the artifacts themselves, historic items made from various materials including gold, silver, iron, and precious stones, which would naturally create complex scan patterns. Walsh wasn't convinced. She declared that the irregular readings could indicate concealed compartments or hidden materials. She announced that the cases would need to be physically opened for manual inspection. Marcus firmly stated that this would require authorization from the British Embassy and the presence of qualified museum curators. To ensure the artifacts were handled properly, Jennifer, Walsh's response was swift and harsh. She stated that airport security didn't need embassy permission to ensure the safety of the traveling public. If Marcus and Sarah continued to refuse cooperation, they would be charged with obstruction, and the cargo would be seized pending a full investigation. The cases would be opened regardless, but their cooperation now might help resolve things more quickly. Sarah moved to stand directly in front of the cargo trolley, her military bearing evident in every line of her posture. She stated clearly and loudly that they were on an official diplomatic mission, transporting items owned by the British Crown, and that any attempt to forcibly open the sealed cases without proper authority would constitute an international incident. Her voice carried across the terminal, and Marcus noticed several travelers had stopped to watch the confrontation, some recording it on their phones. This public attention seemed to make some of the airport officers uncomfortable. Chief Blake, who had been observing from the sidelines, approached Supervisor Walsh and spoke to her in low tones. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but Blake's body language suggested he was advising caution. Whatever intelligence report had triggered this enhanced security response, the chief apparently recognized that the situation needed to be handled more delicately. Walsh pulled out her radio and stepped away to make a call, leaving the other officers to maintain their positions around Marcus, Sarah, and the artifacts. The standoff continued for several tense minutes. Marcus used this time to mentally review his options. They couldn't simply surrender the artifacts to be opened by unqualified personnel who might damage them. But they also couldn't physically fight their way past a dozen security officers, and attempting to do so would only make everything worse. A new figure emerged from the airport administration offices, a tall man in an expensive suit who walked with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. He was introduced as Airport Director James Patterson, and he had clearly been briefed on the situation. His arrival seemed to shift the dynamic slightly, as even Supervisor Walsh straightened her posture and adjusted her tone when speaking to him. Patterson reviewed the documents that Marcus and Sarah had provided, taking more care than the security officers had shown earlier. He examined the diplomatic seals, the ministry authorizations, and the detailed manifest of the artifacts. Marcus watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of whether this man would be reasonable or simply another obstacle to overcome. After several minutes of review, Patterson looked up and asked a simple question. Why, if everything was properly authorized and documented, were Marcus and Sarah so resistant to a simple security inspection? It was a fair question, and Marcus provided a thorough answer. He explained the historical value of the items, the specific requirements for their handling, the international agreements governing the transport of cultural property, and the potential consequences of improper treatment of artifacts that belong to the British people and their shared heritage. Patterson listened carefully, nodding occasionally. When Marcus finished, the airport director turned to Supervisor Walsh and asked about the specific intelligence that had triggered this enhanced security response. Walsh hesitated, then admitted that the information had been vague, mentioning only that suspicious cargo might be moving through the airport that morning on a diplomatic transport. There had been no specific mention of royal artifacts or British military personnel. The director's expression grew stern as he absorbed this information. He asked whether Walsh had actually verified the intelligence before initiating this aggressive inspection process. The supervisor defended her actions, citing the need for caution in an era of heightened security threats. But Marcus could see that Patterson was reconsidering the situation, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt a small flicker of hope that reason might prevail. Before Director Patterson could make a decision, Officer Morrison's radio crackled with an urgent message. Whatever was communicated caused visible alarm among the security team. Morrison immediately approached Supervisor Walsh and spoke rapidly in her ear, gesturing toward another section of the terminal. Walsh's face went pale and she quickly excused herself, rushing away with several officers following behind her. Marcus and Sarah exchanged puzzled glances. Something significant was happening elsewhere in the airport, something that clearly took priority over their inspection. Chief Blake remained with a smaller group of officers, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. The remaining security personnel seemed uncertain about what to do without their supervisor present to give orders. Director Patterson seized this moment to take control. He asked Marcus and Sarah to accompany him to a private conference room, where they could discuss the matter away from the public eye. The artifacts would be moved under guard to a secure holding area, still sealed, while they worked to resolve the situation properly. This seemed like a reasonable compromise, and Marcus agreed, though he insisted that either he or Sarah remain with the cargo at all times. They arranged that Sarah would accompany the artifacts to the secure storage facility while Marcus went with Patterson to make the necessary calls to resolve this diplomatic complication. As they separated, Marcus caught Sarah's eye and saw the determination there. She would protect those artifacts with her life if necessary, and he trusted her completely to do so. In the conference room, Patterson provided Marcus with a secure line to contact the British Embassy. Marcus reached the duty officer and quickly explained the situation, emphasizing the urgency and the irregular nature of the security response. The embassy official immediately recognized the severity of the problem and promised to dispatch their senior diplomatic liaison to the airport within 30 minutes. While they waited, Patterson apologized for the aggressive approach his security team had taken. He explained that airports had been under immense pressure following several recent security incidents, and personnel were sometimes too eager to demonstrate vigilance. However, he acknowledged that this situation had been handled poorly, and he was committed to resolving it appropriately. Marcus appreciated the director's candor but remained wary. Something about the entire incident still didn't add up. The timing had been too specific, the intelligence too conveniently vague, and the response too aggressive for a routine security matter. He began to wonder whether someone had deliberately tried to disrupt their mission, though he couldn't imagine who or why. His thoughts were interrupted when Patterson's assistant knocked on the conference room door looking flustered. She reported that Supervisor Walsh was demanding to speak with the director immediately regarding an urgent security matter. Patterson excused himself, leaving Marcus alone in the room with a single security guard stationed outside. Marcus used this opportunity to check his secure device for updates. He found several messages from his commanding officer demanding to know what was happening and why the mission timeline had been disrupted. There was also a message from Sarah sent just moments ago that made his blood run cold. She reported that while being escorted to the secure storage area, she had overheard officers discussing the need to complete the inspection before anyone from the embassy arrives. This confirmed Marcus's suspicions that something more than routine security concerns was at play. Someone within the airport security structure was pushing for the artifacts to be examined, despite proper documentation and authorization. But why? What could anyone hope to gain from forcibly inspecting properly declared diplomatic cargo? He stood and walked to the door, intending to return to where Sarah and the artifacts were located. The security guard politely but firmly informed him that Director Patterson had requested he remain in the conference room until the situation was fully resolved. Marcus insisted that he needed to be with his cargo, but the guard remained unmoved. Following his orders, growing increasingly frustrated, Marcus decided to call his commanding officer directly on a secure military line. Colonel Richard Ashford answered immediately, his voice tight with concern. Marcus provided a concise briefing on everything that had transpired since their arrival at the airport. The colonel listened without interruption, then delivered news that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Intelligence Services had just informed the Ministry of Defense about a potential theft operation targeting valuable items in transit through major airports. The criminal organization behind it had reportedly placed informants within airport security teams at several locations. These informants would flag specific cargo for enhanced inspection, during which the real security personnel would be distracted, while accomplices either stole items or replaced them with counterfeits. The colonel's words suddenly made everything clear. This wasn't about terrorism or routine security. Someone within the airport security team was attempting to steal the royal artifacts or, at minimum, disrupt the mission long enough for a theft to occur. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate as he realized Sarah was currently alone with those artifacts and potentially compromised officers. He demanded that the guard allow him to leave immediately, explaining that there was a credible threat to the cargo. The guard, following protocol, refused and called for backup instead. Within seconds, 2 more security officers arrived outside the conference room. Marcus found himself effectively detained, unable to reach Sarah or protect the artifacts he had sworn to safeguard. Marcus tried the door handle and found it locked from the outside. The conference room had become a comfortable prison. He paced the small space, his mind racing through options. He could call the embassy again, but they were already sending someone. He could contact local police, but explaining the situation would take precious time. He needed to reach Sarah now. Using his military training, he examined the room for alternative exits. There was a window, but it was sealed in reinforced glass. The ventilation grates were too small to provide escape. The door was solid and would require significant force to breach, which would alert the guards immediately and likely result in his arrest for destruction of property and assault. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. Marcus answered cautiously. The voice on the other end identified himself as Detective Inspector Graham Foster from the Metropolitan Police Anti-Corruption Unit. Foster explained that they had been investigating suspicious activities at the airport for several weeks and had been monitoring security communications. They had detected the unusual treatment of Marcus's diplomatic cargo and suspected it might be connected to their investigation. Marcus quickly explained his current situation, trapped in a conference room while his partner remained with valuable artifacts in the company of potentially compromised security officers. Foster assured him that police units were already en route to the airport, but asked Marcus to describe exactly where Sarah had been taken with the cargo. The problem was that Marcus didn't know precisely where the secure storage facility was located. Sarah had been escorted away before he could note the exact route. He tried to remember any details from the brief glimpse he had of them leaving, but the airport was enormous with countless corridors and storage areas. Foster told him to remain calm and stay on the line. The detective was coordinating with airport police to locate both Sarah and the artifacts. In the meantime, Marcus should do nothing that might alert the suspects that law enforcement was closing in. Any sudden action could endanger Sarah or provide the criminals with an opportunity to flee with the stolen artifacts. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Marcus remained on the phone with Detective Foster, providing any information that might help locate Sarah. He described her appearance, her uniform, the cargo trolley with the artifact cases, and the officers he remembered seeing as part of the escort team. Every detail might prove crucial. Through the door, Marcus could hear raised voices in the corridor outside. The security guards were arguing with someone, but he couldn't make out the words clearly. Then the door unlocked and Director Patterson entered, his face flushed with anger and concern. Behind him stood a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Ambassador Claire Morrison from the British Embassy. Patterson apologized profusely for the delay and the manner in which Marcus had been treated. He explained that there had been a serious situation developing in another part of the airport that had required immediate attention. However, he had now been fully briefed on the intelligence regarding potential theft operations, and he understood that Marcus's cargo might be targeted. Marcus cut through the pleasantries and demanded to know where Sarah and the artifacts were located at that exact moment. Patterson pulled out his radio and attempted to contact the officers who had escorted her to the secure facility. There was no response. He tried again, using different channels and calling specific officers by name. The silence that greeted each attempt was deafening. Ambassador Morrison's expression shifted from diplomatic courtesy to genuine alarm as she grasped the implications. She immediately began making calls on her own phone, mobilizing additional embassy security personnel and demand. Marcus could wait no longer. He informed Director Patterson that he was going to find his partner and the artifacts with or without permission. The military officer in him had taken over, and his duty to protect the cargo superseded any concern about airport protocols or diplomatic niceties. Ambassador Morrison immediately stated that she would accompany him, giving their search official diplomatic authority. Patterson wisely chose not to obstruct them. Instead, he assigned Chief Blake to guide them to the secure storage area, and he contacted airport police to meet them there. The group moved quickly through the terminal corridors, their urgent pace drawing curious stares from travelers and airport staff. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to his side, where he would normally carry a sidearm when on duty at the palace, but firearms were prohibited on this diplomatic mission. Detective Foster remained on the phone with Marcus, coordinating the police response from his location across the city. He informed Marcus that they had identified 3 airport security officers who were under investigation for potential involvement in cargo theft operations. Unfortunately, 2 of those 3 officers had been part of the team that escorted Sarah and the artifacts to the storage facility. The news hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain focused. Sarah was an exceptionally capable officer with extensive training in personal protection and defensive tactics. She wouldn't surrender the artifacts without a fight, and she knew how to handle dangerous situations. He had to trust in her abilities while racing to reach her. They descended a flight of stairs into the lower levels of the airport, where cargo operations and secure storage facilities were located. The corridors here were utilitarian, with bare concrete walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. Few people were visible in this section, just occasional cargo handlers moving between storage bays with forklifts and hand trucks. Chief Blake led them to a heavy security door marked with signs indicating it was a restricted access cargo holding area. He swiped his security card, but the door remained locked. The electronic panel showed a red light, indicating that the system had been overridden. Someone with higher access privileges had sealed this section, preventing entry through normal means. Patterson immediately used his master override code, but even that failed to unlock the door. Someone had deliberately locked down this section of the facility. The director's face darkened with anger as he realized the extent of the security breach occurring in his airport. He grabbed his radio and ordered maintenance to bring cutting equipment to open the door immediately. Marcus couldn't wait for cutting tools. He examined the door carefully, looking for any weakness or alternative entry point. There was a ventilation duct at floor level, but it was far too small for a person to crawl through. However, Marcus noticed that the acoustic ceiling panels in the corridor might provide access to the space above the storage area. Without hesitation, he climbed onto a storage cart and pushed aside a ceiling panel. Above was a narrow crawl space filled with pipes, electrical conduits, and ventilation ducts. It wasn't designed for human passage, but Marcus was determined to find a way. Ambassador Morrison protested that this was too dangerous, but Marcus was already pulling himself up into the cramped space. He crawled forward carefully, testing each support beam before putting his full weight on it. The space was dark except for occasional light seeping through gaps in the ceiling panels. He could hear muffled sounds from below, voices raised in argument. One of those voices was Sarah's, and relief flooded through him knowing she was still actively resisting whatever situation she faced. Marcus moved as quickly as the confined space allowed, following the direction of the voices. His uniform caught on sharp edges of metal brackets and dust filled his nose and throat, but he pressed forward. Through a gap between panels, he could finally see down into the storage area below. Sarah stood with her back to the artifact trolley, facing 3 airport security officers. Marcus recognized 2 of them as part of the group that had initially surrounded them at the security checkpoint. The third was Officer Morrison, the young man whose overconfident swagger had first alerted Marcus that something was wrong. Morrison was speaking to Sarah in a tone that was simultaneously threatening and falsely reasonable. He insisted that they were simply following procedures for inspecting the cargo, and that her resistance was making things difficult for everyone. Sarah's response was calm but firm. She stated that she would not allow unauthorized personnel to access the sealed artifact cases, and that any attempt to do so would be reported as theft of British Crown property. One of the other officers, a heavy-set man Marcus didn't recognize, moved toward the trolley as if to grab one of the cases. Sarah instantly shifted her position, blocking his approach with practiced efficiency. She warned him that any physical assault on a diplomatic courier would constitute an international incident and would result in serious criminal charges. The situation was clearly at an impasse. The officers couldn't access the artifacts without physically overpowering Sarah, but they also knew that assaulting a uniformed British military officer would create exactly the kind of attention they presumably wanted to avoid. Marcus needed to act before someone made a decision that would escalate the conflict into violence. He carefully removed the ceiling panel directly above the scene, creating an opening. All 4 people below looked up in surprise as Marcus called down to identify himself. He informed the officers that the storage area was surrounded, that police were en route, and that their actions were being monitored by military intelligence and diplomatic services. He advised them to step away from the artifacts and his partner immediately. The effect of his words was dramatic. 2 of the officers immediately moved away from Sarah, their faces showing a mix of fear and calculation as they processed this new development. But Morrison reacted differently. His hand moved to his radio, and he began speaking urgently into it, clearly alerting someone else about the situation. Marcus made a quick decision. He dropped through the ceiling opening, landing hard on the concrete floor but managing to roll with the impact to avoid injury. He positioned himself between Sarah and the 3 officers, presenting a united front with his partner. Together they made it clear that access to the artifacts would require going through both of them. Morrison finished his radio communication and addressed Marcus directly. He claimed there had been a misunderstanding, that they were simply following enhanced security protocols, and that Captain Williams and Lieutenant Chen were overreacting to routine procedures. His tone was smooth and professional, but his eyes told a different story. He was stalling, waiting for something. Marcus heard the sound of approaching footsteps outside the locked security door. Heavy impact suggested someone was working to breach it, probably the maintenance crew with cutting equipment that Director Patterson had summoned. But there were other sounds too, coming from a different direction within the storage facility. Someone else was approaching through the cargo area's internal corridors. Sarah caught Marcus's eye and tilted her head slightly toward a side passage, indicating the direction of the approaching sounds. Marcus understood immediately. Morrison's radio call had summoned reinforcements, possibly more corrupt officers or even accomplices from outside the airport security structure. They were about to be outnumbered and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Marcus moved to position the artifact trolley against a wall, reducing the angles from which it could be accessed. Sarah understood his tactical thinking and moved with him, creating a defensive position. If they were going to be attacked or overwhelmed, they would at least make it as difficult as possible for anyone to reach the artifacts they were sworn to protect. 4 men emerged from the side passage, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten. These weren't airport security officers. They wore maintenance uniforms, but their movements and bearings screamed military or law enforcement training. These were professionals, and their presence transformed the situation from a bureaucratic standoff into something far more dangerous. The leader of this new group was a tall man with cold eyes who looked at the artifacts with undisguised interest. He ignored Marcus and Sarah entirely at first, speaking directly to Morrison in a low voice. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but Morrison's body language shifted from confident to subordinate. Clearly, this man was in charge of whatever operation was unfolding. The tall man finally turned his attention to Marcus and Sarah. He introduced himself simply as Collins and suggested that everyone remain calm and professional. He claimed to be with a specialized government agency conducting an investigation into security vulnerabilities in international cargo transport. The royal artifacts, he explained, had been flagged as a test case to evaluate whether valuable items could be adequately protected against determined theft attempts. Marcus didn't believe a word of it. No legitimate government agency would conduct such an operation without coordinating with the military officers responsible for the cargo. No actual security test would involve locking diplomatic couriers in conference rooms and cutting off their communications. This was a criminal operation, poorly disguised with official-sounding explanations. Sarah voiced what Marcus was thinking, flatly stating that Collins was lying, and that they would not surrender the artifacts to him or anyone else without proper authorization from their chain of command and the British Embassy. Her directness seemed to surprise Collins, who had apparently expected them to be more easily intimidated or confused by his fabricated story. Collins's expression hardened. He informed them that they were interfering with a government investigation and could be charged with obstruction. If they simply stepped aside and allowed the inspection to proceed, the matter could be resolved quickly and they could continue with their mission. If they continued to resist, things would become much more complicated for everyone involved. Marcus responded by asking Collins to provide identification from whatever agency he claimed to represent. He also requested the name and contact information of Collins's supervisor, so that proper coordination could be established through official channels. These were reasonable requests that any legitimate government agent would be prepared to fulfill immediately. Collins hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Marcus saw confirmation of what he already knew. This was a theft operation, pure and simple. These men intended to steal the royal artifacts, or at minimum photograph, and catalog them for information that could be sold to private collectors or foreign governments interested in British historical treasures. The sound of metal being cut echoed from the direction of the secured door. Patterson's maintenance crew was making progress in breaking through. Collins heard it too, and his demeanor shifted from falsely professional to openly threatening. He told his companions in the maintenance uniforms to handle the situation, and two of them immediately moved toward the door with tools in hand, clearly intending to barricade or further secure it against entry. Marcus made a split-second decision. He couldn't allow Collins and his people to maintain control of the situation until they overwhelmed the defenses or found another way to access the artifacts. He needed to create chaos and confusion that would disrupt their plans, and buy time for the police and airport security. To breach the storage area, he suddenly grabbed one of the lighter artifact cases from the trolley and held it over his head, shouting that he would drop and destroy it if anyone came closer. The case contained historical documents that, while priceless, were relatively sturdy compared to the fragile crowns and ceremonial items in the other containers. Marcus was gambling that Collins and his team didn't know exactly which case held which artifacts, and that the threat of destroying any of them would force a pause in their aggressive approach. The gambit worked. Collins immediately held up his hand, stopping his companions from advancing. He tried to speak calmly to Marcus, suggesting that destroying national treasures would end Marcus's military career and result in criminal charges. Marcus countered that his career would be destroyed anyway if he allowed the artifacts to be stolen, and that at least this way the thieves wouldn't profit from their crime. Sarah understood Marcus's strategy instantly. She moved to grab another case, positioning herself so that she and Marcus covered different angles of the room. Now Collins and his team faced the prospect of having to physically subdue two trained military officers who were prepared to destroy the very items they were trying to steal. The criminal calculus had shifted dramatically. Officer Morrison looked panicked, clearly out of his depth in this escalating confrontation. The other airport security officers who had accompanied him seemed equally uncertain, exchanging nervous glances. These men had probably signed on for simple theft through security bypass procedures, not for a violent confrontation with military personnel who were prepared to destroy millions of pounds worth of artifacts rather than surrender them. Collins tried a different approach. He offered Marcus and Sarah money to simply walk away and report that they had been overpowered by a larger force. He claimed he could arrange for £250,000 to be deposited in offshore accounts for each of them, with no way to trace the funds back to this incident. It was a substantial bribe, enough to tempt many people, but it only served to insult Marcus and Sarah, who had dedicated their lives to service and honor. Sarah's response was to shift her grip on the artifact case she held, positioning it even more precariously. She stated clearly that they were royal guards, and that they would rather die protecting the crown's property than accept money from thieves and traitors. Her words carried absolute conviction, and Marcus felt immense pride in his partner's unwavering integrity. The sound of the security door being breached suddenly intensified. Metal shrieked as the cutting equipment finally severed the locking mechanism. Voices could be heard from the corridor beyond, calling out orders and establishing positions. The rescue team was about to break through, and Collins knew his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. He made a hand signal to his companions, and they all began moving toward the side passage through which they had entered. Collins pointed at Marcus and Sarah, stating coldly that this wasn't over, that they had made powerful enemies and that there would be consequences for their interference. It was meant to be intimidating, but to Marcus it simply sounded like the impotent threats of a criminal whose plan had failed. The security door finally burst open, and Director Patterson rushed in, followed by Chief Blake, Ambassador Morrison, and a squad of armed airport police officers. Right behind them came several men in suits who identified themselves as detectives from the Metropolitan Police. The room suddenly filled with law enforcement personnel, completely transforming the dynamics of the situation. Collins and his team were immediately surrounded and ordered to get on the ground. They complied without resistance, apparently calculating that escape was impossible, and that fighting would only add more serious charges to whatever they would eventually face. Officer Morrison and his corrupt colleagues were also detained, their security badges and radios confiscated as evidence. Marcus and Sarah carefully returned the artifact cases to the trolley, their hands shaking slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Ambassador Morrison approached them, her expression showing a mixture of relief, admiration, and concern. She thanked them for their extraordinary dedication and assured them that the embassy would provide full support for any statements or testimony they needed to provide. She also informed them that new security arrangements would be made for transporting the artifacts, possibly delaying their mission by several days while proper precautions were established. Detective Foster arrived moments later, the same officer who had been coordinating with Marcus by phone. He immediately began directing his team to secure the scene and document evidence. He pulled Marcus and Sarah aside for initial statements, praising their handling of an extremely difficult situation. He explained that this criminal network had been operating for months, stealing or copying valuable items from diplomatic and commercial cargo shipments at multiple airports. The detective revealed that Collins was actually named Robert Caldwell, a former intelligence officer who had been dismissed from service years ago for corruption. He had assembled a team of current and former law enforcement and security personnel to exploit their inside knowledge of cargo handling procedures. The operation had netted them millions in stolen artwork, historical artifacts, and commercial prototypes before authorities had finally begun to uncover the pattern. Marcus and Sarah's resistance had prevented what would have been the network's most valuable theft yet. The royal artifacts would have been extremely difficult to sell intact, but Caldwell had connections with wealthy private collectors who operated outside legal channels. Some of the items might have been broken down for their precious metal and gem content, destroying irreplaceable pieces of British history for mere monetary value. As the immediate chaos subsided and the arrested criminals were led away in handcuffs, Marcus and Sarah finally had a moment to process everything that had happened. They sat on cargo crates in the now secure storage area, still positioned protectively near the artifact trolley even though the danger had passed. Years of training and discipline made it nearly impossible for them to relax their vigilance. Director Patterson approached them with genuine contrition. He explained that airport management would be conducting a complete review of security protocols and personnel screening procedures. The fact that corrupt officers had been able to operate within his facility was a failure he took personally. He promised that comprehensive reforms would be implemented to prevent any similar incidents in the future. Marcus appreciated the director's accountability, but his primary concern remained completing their mission. He asked when the artifacts could be safely transported to their scheduled diplomatic exhibition. Patterson consulted with Detective Foster and Ambassador Morrison before responding. Given the security breach and the need for thorough investigation, they recommended waiting at least 48 hours before attempting another transport. Sarah pointed out that the exhibition opening in Washington, D.C. was scheduled in just 4 days. The artifacts needed to arrive, be authenticated by museum staff, and be properly installed in the exhibition space before the opening ceremony, attended by dignitaries from both nations. A 48-hour delay would leave almost no margin for error or additional complications. Ambassador Morrison made several calls to coordinate with officials in both London and Washington. After intense negotiations, an alternative plan emerged. Rather than commercial air transport, even with diplomatic protocols, the artifacts would be moved on a military aircraft with full armed security. The flight would depart from a Royal Air Force base rather than a civilian airport, eliminating the vulnerability of moving through public facilities. Marcus and Sarah would still serve as the primary custodians of the artifacts, but they would be accompanied by a full security detail including embassy protection officers and military police. The change in plans meant the mission would be delayed by only 24 hours while arrangements were finalized. It wasn't ideal, but it was acceptable given the circumstances. The artifacts were carefully examined by museum curators who had rushed to the airport upon learning of the incident. They checked each piece thoroughly for any damage from the scanning equipment or rough handling. Miraculously, everything remained intact. The specialized cases had done their job, protecting the precious historical items from harm despite the chaotic events surrounding them. Marcus and Sarah provided detailed written statements to Detective Foster's investigation team. They described every interaction with the corrupt officers, every threat made by Caldwell and his associates, and every decision they had made to protect the artifacts. The statements would form crucial evidence in the prosecution of everyone involved in the theft network. Media had begun to gather outside the airport, having heard reports of a major security incident and arrests. Airport administration worked to control the information flow, not wanting to cause panic among travelers or reveal operational security details that might aid future criminals. However, word inevitably leaked about the attempted theft of royal artifacts and the brave military officers who had prevented it. By evening, Marcus and Sarah found themselves in the unexpected position of being praised as heroes. Messages arrived from their commanding officers, from Ministry of Defense officials, and eventually from the royal household itself, expressing gratitude for their dedication and service. The artifacts they had protected were more than just valuable objects. They represented the nation's history and cultural heritage. Sarah admitted to Marcus that there had been a moment during the confrontation when she wasn't sure they would succeed. When Caldwell and his team had first appeared, outnumbering them significantly, she had calculated their odds and found them discouraging. But she had also known that surrendering wasn't an option, that their duty required them to resist regardless of the odds. Marcus shared that his decision to threaten destroying the artifacts had been one of the most difficult of his career. Even in that moment, knowing the items were irreplaceable, he had been prepared to follow through if necessary. The principle was simple: better to destroy something precious than to allow it to be stolen and lost forever to private hands. It was a stark choice, but sometimes duty demanded stark choices. Over the following days, as investigations continued and security arrangements were finalized, more details emerged about the criminal network Caldwell had assembled. At least 7 airports across Europe had been infiltrated with corrupt personnel. Dozens of thefts had occurred over an 18-month period, with losses exceeding £30 million. Several other diplomatic missions had been targeted, though none involving items as significant as the royal artifacts. The exposure of the network led to widespread reforms in airport security procedures across multiple nations. Enhanced background checks, rotation of personnel assignments, and new oversight mechanisms were implemented to reduce opportunities for corruption. Marcus and Sarah's resistance had not only saved the artifacts in their care, but had also triggered systemic changes that would benefit countless future missions. The rescheduled transport went flawlessly. The military aircraft departed from RAF Northolt with its precious cargo, escorted by fighter jets for a portion of the journey, as a symbolic display of the mission's importance. Marcus and Sarah sat in the cargo hold throughout the flight, never leaving the artifacts unattended, maintaining their vigilant watch even when additional security made it technically unnecessary. When they arrived in Washington, D.C., they were greeted by American military honor guards and diplomatic officials who had been briefed on the attempted theft in London. The reception was far more ceremonious than originally planned. With both nations wanting to mark the successful completion of a mission that had almost gone terribly wrong. The exhibition opened on schedule to widespread acclaim. Thousands of visitors came to view the royal artifacts, each item carefully displayed with explanatory text about its historical significance. Few of those visitors knew how close these treasures had come to being stolen, how two dedicated officers had risked everything to protect them. Marcus and Sarah attended the opening ceremony in their dress uniforms, standing at attention as ambassadors and ministers gave speeches about the enduring friendship between Britain and America. They were personally thanked by both nations' representatives for their service and dedication. The recognition was gratifying, but both officers knew they had simply done their duty as they understood it. After the ceremony, a young girl approached Sarah and asked what it was like to be a hero. Sarah smiled and told her that heroes were just ordinary people, who chose to do the right thing even when it was difficult or dangerous. She encouraged the girl to study hard, work with dedication, and always stand up for what she believed was right. Those qualities, Sarah explained, were more important than any special training or position. The girl asked if Sarah had been scared during the confrontation at the airport. Sarah admitted that she had been terrified at certain moments, but that courage wasn't about not feeling fear. Courage was about doing what needed to be done despite the fear. Marcus nodded in agreement, adding that working with a trusted partner made it easier to be brave because you knew someone had your back. As they flew back to London several days later, mission successfully completed, Marcus and Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. They had encountered corruption, faced down criminals, and protected treasures that belonged not to any individual, but to the collective heritage of their nation. They had upheld the traditions of the Royal Guard, proving that honor and duty still meant something in a complicated world. Their commanding officer met them upon arrival, informing them that they would both receive commendations for their actions. More significantly, they were being recommended for assignment to an elite protection unit responsible for the security of the highest value royal assets. Their performance under pressure had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and integrity required for such sensitive positions. Marcus and Sarah accepted the recognition with humility, knowing that countless other officers would have acted similarly in their place. The Royal Guard attracted people who valued service above self, who understood that some things were worth protecting regardless of personal cost. They had been tested and had not been found wanting, but they viewed this as simply living up to the standards expected of anyone wearing their uniform. In the weeks that followed, as the investigation continued and arrests were made across multiple countries, Marcus and Sarah returned to their regular duties. They stood guard at Buckingham Palace, protected visiting dignitaries, and trained new officers in the traditions of their service. But they carried with them the knowledge that when the moment of crisis had come, when everything depended on their choices and actions, they had made the right decisions. The royal artifacts remained on display in Washington for 3 months before returning to London, where they would be exhibited at several museums so that more